The wind crawled across the barren plains of Red Hollow the afternoon it all began, carrying with it the bitter scent of dust, secrets, and a warning that would soon shake the entire town. Rancher Caleb Harlow, a man known for his iron fists and quiet heart, rode down the narrow trail that led to the abandoned church at the edge of the valley, a place locals avoided ever since the mines collapsed years ago, burying 20 men and the truth with them. He had come searching for supplies, nothing more. But fate had different plans when he found Ilara. Yes, Ilara, the mysterious woman who arrived in town 3 weeks earlier, dressed in simple clothes, hiding her face beneath a slate-gray shawl, speaking to no one, yet moving like someone who carried a story too heavy for her own bones. She stood near the cracked chapel door, her hands trembling as she clutched an old leather journal to her chest, her eyes staring into Caleb's with a strange mix of fear and relief, as though she had been waiting for him and dreaded it at the same time. "You shouldn't be here," Caleb muttered, stepping off his horse and narrowing his eyes as he scanned the quiet valley around them, because everything in his gut screamed danger, the kind that smelled like gunpowder and old sins. And before he could ask anything more, Ilara stepped close, too close, her breath shaking, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "That is forbidden," dropping those 3 words like stones into a still lake. Words that froze Caleb where he stood, words that felt heavier than the colt on his hip. She opened the journal, with trembling fingers revealing sketches of the collapsed mine, names of the 20 dead men, and at the final page, a mark Caleb recognized instantly, a brand belonging not to cattle, but to the secret vigilante. Circle believed to be long dead, a group of powerful town elders who built Red Hollow on corruption. Bribes and threats buried deeper than the mine itself. The brand was burned into the town only once before, on Caleb's father, whose mysterious death Caleb had been forced to accept as an accident, but now, seeing the symbol glowing faintly under the light, rage and heartbreak twisted inside him like barbed wire. Ilara explained in breathless fragments that she had witnessed the truth, that the mine collapse was orchestrated to hide illegal gold smuggling, that the elders murdered Caleb's father when he discovered the conspiracy, and that the journal held the last surviving evidence, but revealing it was forbidden by a code enforced with bullets. Silence and fear. Caleb leaned closer, voice cracking like dry timber. "Why, tell me?" And she whispered, eyes wet, "Because you're the only one brave enough to face them. And because they're coming for me tonight." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky was clear, the kind of omen Red Hollow had learned to fear. And just as Caleb grabbed her hand to pull her toward his horse, he spotted 3 riders approaching from the ridge, the enforcers of the Forbidden Order, dressed in black dusters, rifles gleaming in the fading light. What followed was chaos, a wild sprint across the prairie, bullets slicing the air, Ilara holding the journal tight while Caleb fought to keep them alive, riding harder than he had ever ridden in his life, each shot driving the truth deeper into him, each moment proving that Ilara's whisper wasn't just a warning, it was a prophecy. By the time they reached the edge of town, the fight had only begun. Caleb stood tall, blood on his lip, fire in his heart, as he roared to the townsfolk that they had been lied to, manipulated, used, and that the forbidden truth would no longer stay buried. Men stepped forward, women clutched their children, fear turning to fury as the journal's pages passed from hand to hand. And within minutes, Red Hollow erupted into an uprising that echoed across the frontier. A rebellion sparked by the whisper of one terrified woman and the courage of one determined rancher. And as the town rallied behind him, Ilara watched Caleb with a bittersweet smile, knowing she had placed her trust in the right man, knowing the forbidden had finally become the beginning of justice. Caleb looked at the crowd, breathless and humbled, and said, "If we stay silent, we stay slaves. Today, we choose truth," a line that became legend in Red Hollow for generations. And dear viewer, if this story gripped your heart, if you felt the dust, the danger, the fire of courage rising in the West, then don't forget, Your one subscribe gives us the strength to bring more powerful stories like this to life. So hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. The uprising of Red Hollow had barely begun when night fell like a black curtain across the plains, the kind that swallowed sound, hope, and even the courage of proud men. Yet Caleb Harlow stood at the center of the town square as if the darkness feared him instead. Lanterns flickered in dozens of nervous hands, faces pale but determined after reading the forbidden truth hidden in Ilara's journal, while the old wooden church bell, silent for years, rang loudly as if announcing that the ghosts of the mine were finally awake. Caleb glanced at Ilara, who stood beside him with the strength of someone who had run from fear for too long, and was finally ready to stop running, her shawl slipping slightly as the cold breeze cut across the street. Then Sheriff Garrison arrived, stomping across the dust with his badge shining like a threat. Though everyone knew exactly who he served, the same secret Council Ilara had exposed. His voice thundered, ordering the crowd to disperse, calling them fools for believing a runaway woman and a broken rancher. But for the first time in years, no one stepped back, no one bowed their head. And Caleb walked forward with the journal held high and said, "If I'm broken, Sheriff, then you're the hammer that did it." The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun, but before he could draw, old man Jasper, who had lost 2 sons in the mine collapse, shouted, "Let him speak!" And suddenly the whole town roared in agreement, forcing Garrison to retreat a step. Then, too, a shiver crawling up his spine. As the tension thickened, Ilara whispered urgently to Caleb that the enforcers of the Forbidden Order, the same Black Duster riders who had chased them earlier, were gathering beyond the ridge, waiting for the sheriff's signal to slaughter the town into silence. Caleb breathed hard, knowing a storm of blood was coming, and he rallied the townsfolk to barricade the streets, overturn wagons, arm themselves with hunting rifles, pitchforks, whatever they could find. Women boarded windows, children were rushed into cellars, and the men lined up behind Caleb, who stood like the last unbroken fence post in a hurricane. Then came the hoofbeats, slow at first, ominous, heavy, echoing through the valley, until nearly 30 armed riders descended upon Red Hollow like a shadow of death. Their leader, a masked figure known only as the Warden, shouted for Caleb to surrender Ilara and the journal or watch everyone burn. But before Caleb could answer, Ilara stepped forward, voice trembling but loud, shouting that she was done hiding, that the truth belonged to everyone, not kept forbidden by the powerful, and Caleb feared that her bravery would be her death. The Warden raised a hand, giving the order to fire, and the street exploded with gunfire, windows shattering, dust flying, men yelling as they ducked behind wagons. Caleb stayed at the front, firing shot after shot with deadly accuracy, refusing to let any rider come close to Ilara. The battle raged like hell itself had opened, horses screaming, bullets tearing through wood, sparks flying from metal, cries of pain mixing with the roar of defiance, and for a moment it seemed the Forbidden Order would crush them under sheer force. But then something miraculous happened. The townspeople, normally timid and broken, stepped out from every corner, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, widows, firing, throwing lanterns, pushing back against the riders with the fury of decades of buried anger. Even young boys climbed rooftops to drop stones onto the invaders. Red Hollow fought not like a town, but like a family, and slowly the riders began to fall back. Caleb spotted the Warden retreating toward the ridge and sprinted after him, tackling him off his horse, the two rolling across the dirt in a vicious fight, fists slamming, dust rising like smoke. When Caleb finally tore the mask off, the town gasped. It wasn't a monster, but Judge Whitlock, the most respected elder in Red Hollow, the man who had preached honesty, fairness, and justice for 20 years. And there it was, the truth behind the forbidden. The judge had orchestrated the mine collapse, killed Caleb's father, and used the Forbidden Order to silence anyone who discovered the gold smuggling scheme. Whitlock spat blood and hatred, screaming that the truth was always meant to stay buried, but Caleb pinned him down, shouting, "Not anymore. As the townsfolk crowded around, their faces illuminated by fire, lanterns, and reborn hope, Whitlock was imprisoned that night, and the riders who survived fled into the darkness, never to return. As sunrise bled across the sky, Red Hollow stood bruised but victorious, breathing freer than they had in decades. Ilara approached Caleb, tears streaming, not of fear now, but of release, and whispered once more, "Thank you." And for the first time since his father's death, Caleb felt whole again. Together, they vowed that no truth would ever be forbidden in Red Hollow again. And dear viewer, if this story shook your heart the way it shook the whole town, hit subscribe now. Your one support inspires me to bring you more powerful stories filled with courage, mystery, and the Wild West's untold secrets. The victory of Red Hollow should have brought peace. But just 3 days after the uprising, the town felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the dust itself whispered that the fight wasn't over. Caleb Harlow woke before sunrise, the memory of battle still burning behind his eyes, and walked through the quiet streets, noticing the boarded windows, the patched bullet holes, and the bruised but hopeful faces of townsfolk rebuilding what the Forbidden Order tried to destroy. Yet something inside him refused to settle, an instinct older than fear, telling him that truth never comes alone. It drags enemies with it. Ilara, now staying in the old church with Mrs. Dawson, stepped outside when she saw Caleb, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes softer now, but carrying a shadow she couldn't shake. She confessed that Judge Whitlock hadn't been the real head of the Forbidden Order. There was someone above him, someone known only as the Patron, a figure powerful enough to manipulate judges, sheriffs, and even governors, a man whose reach stretched far beyond Red Hollow. Caleb felt his heart hammer with a cold dread, because if Whitlock was just a puppet, then the man holding the strings would surely come, looking for the journal, the very journal Ilara risked her life to protect. Just as Caleb opened his mouth to ask more, a distant rumble rolled through the valley, not thunder, not horses, but something heavier, metallic, deliberate. People stepped outside their homes, confusion turning to fear as 2 black wagons approached the town, each escorted by armed men wearing matching grey coats and polished rifles. A sign Caleb recognized immediately. They were Pinkerton agents, lawmen hired by the wealthy, feared by the poor, and loyal only to the highest bidder. The lead agent stepped off the wagon, tall, sharp-eyed, his badge gleaming under the morning sun, and announced in a cold voice that he was Marshal Aldrich Kane, here under federal order to retrieve stolen property. The journal. The townsfolk murmured in panic, but Caleb stepped forward, hands clenched, and told Kane that the journal wasn't stolen. It contained the truth of murder, smuggling, and conspiracy. Kane smirked, replying that truth is only truth when the powerful approve it, and demanded Ilara be handed over as well, claiming she was a fugitive, wanted for treason in 3 territories. Ilara stepped closer to Caleb, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm, and whispered that this was the patron's move. They couldn't kill Whitlock without exposing themselves, so now they were using the federal badge to silence her. Caleb's blood boiled, and he shouted to the marshal that Red Hollow would not be intimidated again, not after everything they'd survived. But Kane signaled his men, and dozens of rifles aimed at the townspeople, turning the dusty street into a powder keg ready to explode. Mrs. Dawson pulled children behind her porch. Jasper grabbed his old shotgun, and within seconds the entire town stood behind Caleb again, wounded, exhausted, but unwilling to surrender the woman who risked everything to free them. Kane's voice echoed sharply as he declared that the town had 5 minutes to comply, or he'd collect the property by force. Ilara's breath shook, her eyes filled with dread, and she looked at Caleb as if this might be the last moment they shared, whispering, "You don't have to protect me, this is my burden." But Caleb stepped closer, gently cupped her face, and whispered back, "You're not facing this alone. Not ever again." And in that instant, the fragile quiet of Red Hollow shattered as a lone gunshot, fired no one knew from which side, and the street erupted into chaos. Pinkertons charged, townsfolk scattered, bullets whistled through the air, Shops shattered, horses screamed, and Caleb grabbed Ilara's hand, pulling her into a narrow alley as gunfire tore apart the dusty street behind them. They ducked behind crates, Caleb firing back with deadly precision while Ilara clutched the journal as if it were her own heartbeat. The marshal's voice roared through the street, promising to burn Red Hollow to the ground if they didn't surrender. And for the first time since the uprising, Caleb realized this wasn't a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for survival. As smoke filled the town and chaos thundered around them, Ilara whispered that the only way out was to reach the canyon trail at nightfall, where an old ally of her father waited, someone who knew the patron's identity, someone who could turn the tide. Caleb nodded, breathing hard, his eyes blazing with the promise of a man who would tear down the whole frontier if that's what it took to protect the woman fate had placed in his life. And dear viewer, if you're still on this dangerous ride with Caleb and Ilara, hit subscribe now. Your one support helps us continue this Wild West saga filled with truth, danger, and forbidden secrets. Gunfire still echoed through the twisting alleys of Red Hollow as Caleb pulled Ilara deeper into the shadowed back streets, their breaths ragged, their boots slamming against the dirt, while Pinkertons scoured every corner like wolves scenting blood. Smoke rose from shattered windows. Frightened shouts filled the air, and the once proud town that had stood united just days ago now trembled under the iron fist of Marshal Kane, who barked orders for his men to find the journal and the traitor woman at any cost. Caleb's mind raced. He knew the Pinkertons were elite, relentless, and funded by the kind of wealth you could smell but never see. Wealth controlled by the patron, the man who truly ran the forbidden order from the shadows. Protecting Ilara wasn't just brave anymore. It was like trying to hold back a storm with bare hands. They slipped through a narrow gap between old stables, climbing over a collapsed fence into the outskirts where the prairie opened wide, glowing under the setting sun like a sea of fading fire. Ilara stumbled, clutching the journal tightly, her breath shaking as she whispered Caleb's name in a voice that made his heart tighten, for he had never heard fear mixed with such trust. He steadied her, his rough hands gentler than she expected, promising they would make it to the canyon trail, no matter what it took. As twilight deepened, they stayed low, moving through tall grass, hearing distant hoofbeats as Pinkerton riders searched every ridge. The night wind brought cold and silence, wrapping around them like an uneasy warning while they pushed toward the jagged outline of Ravenstone Canyon, a place locals claimed was cursed, haunted or worse, protected by something older than lawmen. Caleb didn't care about superstition anymore. Danger was danger, whether it wore a badge or a ghost. When they reached the canyon's mouth, the world seemed to shift. Towering stone walls rose like ancient sentinels on both sides, their shadows swallowing the moonlight. And the thin path ahead wound into darkness like a serpent waiting to strike. Ilara trembled again, not from cold but from memory. This canyon held secrets she had never dared to share, secrets tied to her father, the Forbidden Order, and the patron himself. Caleb noticed the fear in her eyes and gently asked what she knew, and in the hush of the canyon she confessed that her father had once been part of the Order, that he had broken away when he discovered Whitlock's crimes, and that the patron had ordered his execution, leaving Ilara as the last keeper of the truth. Caleb felt the ground tilt beneath him. Ilara had carried guilt, danger, and destiny on her shoulders all alone, and he wondered how she had survived this long. Before he could say a word, a soft whistle echoed through the canyon, followed by the flicker of firelight, and an older man stepped out from behind a boulder, scarred, limping but armed with a rifle that looked older than the town itself. "Ilara," the man said, his voice rough but laced with familiarity, "your father would have been proud you made it this far." And she ran into his arms with a gasp of relief. Caleb recognized him after a moment. Thorne Maddox, the former deputy who disappeared years ago after challenging Whitlock. A man believed to be dead. Thorne explained he had gone into hiding to protect the last surviving evidence against the patron, and now that Ilara had come with the journal, They finally had a chance to expose everything, but only if they survived the night. The sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly thundered faintly through the canyon entrance. Kane's men were close, far too close, and Thorn whispered urgently for them to follow him into a secret passage carved into the canyon wall. Inside the narrow, torchlit tunnel, Caleb felt the weight of destiny pressing on all of them. The kind that didn't just change a town, it changed the entire West. Ilara walked beside him, her shoulder brushing his, the warmth of her presence grounding him in the chaos. And for a moment, their eyes met in the dim glow, speaking fears and hopes neither dared say aloud, as they descended deeper into the hidden passageway. Toward the unknown ally who knew the patron's true name, Caleb finally understood that this fight was bigger than revenge, bigger than justice. It was about rewriting history that powerful men thought they owned. And dear viewer, if this chapter pulled you deeper into the heart of this dangerous journey, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps bring these Wild West tales of mystery, courage, and forbidden truths to life. The hidden passage twisted deeper into the canyon, lit only by the trembling flame of Thorn's torch as Caleb and Ilara followed close behind, their breaths echoing off ancient stone while the distant thunder of Pinkerton horses shook the earth above them like a warning. That time was running out. The tunnel opened at last into a vast cavern lit by shafts of moonlight cutting through cracks in the ceiling. And there, waiting beside an old mining cart, stood a figure cloaked in a dark coat, tall and still, as if carved from the canyon itself. Thorn motioned Caleb to keep calm, whispering that this was the only man who dared betray the forbidden order from within, the only man alive who knew the patron's true identity. But when the stranger stepped forward and the moonlight struck his face, Ilara gasped, the journal slipping from her hands because the man was her father's closest friend. Marshal Rowan Beckett, long believed to be dead, a man whose funeral the townsfolk had attended years ago. Beckett's voice cracked with age and regret as he explained that he had staged his own death after discovering the patron's plan to expand the smuggling empire beyond the frontier, and he had spent the years since gathering evidence, witnesses, and the final piece of truth hidden in Ilara's journal. Caleb stepped closer, demanding to know the patron's identity once and for all, and Beckett's eyes filled with sorrow as he spoke the name like a curse. Governor Silas Granger, the most powerful man in the territory, the man responsible for funding the Pinkertons, the man whose smiling speeches masked years of bloodshed and corruption. The revelation struck Caleb like a blow, for Granger had visited Red Hollow many times, shaking hands with widows and promising justice while secretly orchestrating their suffering. Before the shock could settle, the cavern trembled violently as explosions shook the canyon. The Pinkertons had found the tunnel entrance, using dynamite to force their way in. Beckett shoved a metal case into Caleb's hands, containing every document needed to expose the governor's crimes, and told them there was one final exit through the old mining shaft far below, but someone needed to hold off Kane's men long enough for the truth to escape. Before anyone could argue, Thorn stepped forward, a resolve glowing in his tired eyes as he said he had run from the order long enough, and tonight he would face them so that Ilara and Caleb could end what her father began. Ilara cried out, begging him not to sacrifice himself, but Thorn only smiled and placed a trembling hand on her cheek, whispering that her father had died to protect the truth, and now it was his turn to finish that promise. With a final nod, he turned toward the thunder of footsteps, raising his rifle as the Pinkertons poured into the cavern like a flood of shadows. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the stone like claps of judgment. Caleb grabbed Ilara's hand, pulling her down the steep mining shaft while Beckett followed, and the three descended into darkness as Thorn's final stand raged above them. They reached a rusted lift at the bottom, Beckett cranking it with all his remaining strength until the old machinery groaned and carried them upward through a vertical tunnel that opened far beyond the canyon, leading into the cold, silent plains under a blazing full moon. But salvation came with no time to breathe. Marshal Kane and the surviving riders were already racing toward them, shouting for revenge and for the journal that could destroy their master. Ilara stumbled behind Caleb as they ran through the tall grass, exhaustion cutting into their bones. But Caleb refused to slow, gripping the case tightly and firing shots behind him with deadly accuracy. Beckett, too old to run fast, turned and aimed his revolver with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime hunting lies, each shot buying them precious seconds. The ridge loomed ahead, the very edge of the canyon, where one wrong step meant falling into darkness. They had nowhere left to run. Kane rode ahead of his men, drawing his rifle, fury burning in his eyes as he screamed that no one defied the patron and lived to tell the tale. Caleb stood firm at the ridge, shielding Ilara with his body, lifting his revolver even as the last bullet clicked empty. The riders charged, then thunder split the night as a single rifle shot rang out, clean, sharp, final. Kane's horse reared violently, and the marshal fell lifeless to the ground, his rifle slipping from limp fingers. Silence washed across the plains as the surviving Pinkertons halted, stunned because Beckett, gasping for breath, had fired the final shot from behind Caleb. Collapsing to his knees as the adrenaline left him, with their leader dead and the truth exposed, the riders slowly dropped their weapons and backed away, fear replacing their cruelty. The dawn rose over the frontier as Caleb, Ilara, and the wounded Beckett returned to Red Hollow, where the townsfolk gathered and listened to the full truth, every name, every crime, every betrayal. Within weeks, the governor's empire crumbled. Newspapers across the territory printed the evidence, and Silas Granger was arrested in front of hundreds. His reign of deception finally ended. Red Hollow rebuilt itself stronger than ever, and Caleb became a symbol of justice, while Ilara became the heart of the town, teaching its people that truth, no matter how forbidden, can free even the darkest places. On a quiet morning months later, Caleb and Ilara stood together at the canyon's edge, remembering Thorne, Beckett, and every soul who fought for the truth, their hands intertwined as the sun painted gold across the cliffs. And dear viewer, if this ending touched your heart, if you traveled every mile of danger with us, don't forget to subscribe. Your one support inspires us to bring more epic, Wild West stories to life, filled with mystery, courage, and unforgettable endings.